Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. Serendipity in the Fog. The city of Edinburgh wore its usual coat of mist that October evening, draping the cobblestone streets in a veil of mystery. The lamps lining the Royal Mile flickered with a golden hue, casting elongated shadows of passers-by onto the wet pavement. Among them was Eleanor, her scarlet scarf trailing behind her like a whisper of warmth in the brisk air. She was late for her shift at the bookshop, but her mind was preoccupied with the letter tucked into her pocket, a letter she had written but hadn't dared to send. Eleanor worked at Chapter and Verse, a small, hidden bookshop nestled at the end of an alley few dared to explore. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, with shelves groaning under the weight of ancient tomes and the scent of aged paper lingering like an unspoken promise. That night, she arrived breathless, her cheeks flushed from both the chill and the sprint. "Cutting it close again, are we?" came the familiar voice of Isaac, her co-worker and partner in literary mischief. His brown eyes twinkled under the warm glow of the chandelier, and his curly hair was perpetually disheveled, as though the very concept of neatness offended him. "Blame the fog," Eleanor replied, shedding her coat and scarf. She didn't mention the letter. She wasn't ready for anyone to know yet. Not even Isaac, her closest friend in the city. The shop was unusually quiet that evening, save for the occasional rustle of pages as customers browsed. It was nearing closing time when he walked in. At first glance, he seemed like any other visitor. A young man in his late 20s, tall and lean, with a wool coat that seemed a size too large for his wiry frame. His eyes, though, deep and gray like the sea before a storm, held a restless intensity that made Eleanor pause as she stalked the shelves. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. He looked up from the spine of a leather-bound journal he'd been examining. For a moment, his expression was unreadable, as though he were deciding whether to answer honestly. "Do you have any books about serendipity?" he asked finally, his voice soft but certain. Eleanor blinked. "Serendipity? As in chance discoveries?" "Precisely, the kind that change everything." It wasn't a request she heard every day. Intrigued, she led him to the philosophy section, where a few titles on fate and chance nestled among weightier tomes. They spoke briefly about one book, then another, until their conversation drifted beyond the shelves. He introduced himself as Adrian, a researcher in quantum mechanics, visiting the city for a conference. Eleanor found herself captivated by his passion for paradoxes and the unpredictable nature of the universe. When the clock struck 9, Isaac began locking up, and Adrian hesitated near the door, as though debating whether to leave. "Would you like to join me for a walk?" he asked, breaking the silence. Eleanor surprised herself by saying yes. They strolled through the labyrinthine streets, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Adrian spoke of multiverses and the strange beauty of uncertainty, while Eleanor shared stories of the bookshop's quirks and her own fascination with serendipitous encounters. It was nearly midnight when they reached the overlook at Calton Hill. The city spread out before them like a tapestry of light and shadow. Adrian turned to her, his expression solemn. "I feel like we were meant to meet tonight," he said, as if some thread of fate brought us together. Eleanor laughed softly. "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe in possibilities," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Before she could respond, a distant sound shattered the moment, the mournful wail of a siren. Adrian stiffened, his face paling. "I have to go," he said abruptly, his tone urgent. "But thank you for tonight." He pressed something into her hand, a small folded paper, before disappearing into the mist, leaving Eleanor standing alone under the starless sky. When she unfolded the note, her breath caught. Written in neat, hurried script were the words, "You won't remember me tomorrow, but I'll never forget tonight." Chapter 2. Shadows of Memory. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a strange sense of unease, as though she had forgotten something important. The autumn sun spilled through her curtains, painting the wooden floor with golden streaks, but the warmth didn't chase away the odd hollowness in her chest. She stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of her dreams, yet the harder she grasped at them, the more they slipped away. It wasn't until she reached into her coat pocket for her keys that she found the note. a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges as if it had been handled too many times. Her stomach fluttered when she unfolded it. "You won't remember me tomorrow, but I'll never forget tonight." The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. She felt as if it belonged to a secret version of herself, a version she couldn't quite recall. Turning the note over, she found no further explanation, no signature, just those cryptic words. At chapter and verse, the day passed like any other. Customers drifted in and out, the shop's bell chiming softly with each arrival. Eleanor tried to focus on her tasks, but her thoughts kept wandering back to the note. She caught herself glancing at the shop's entrance every few minutes, half expecting someone to walk in and solve the mystery. "Are you okay?" Isaac asked as they restocked the shelves in the afternoon. Eleanor hesitated. "Have you ever felt like you forgot something important, but you don't know what it is?" Isaac laughed. "You mean like when you leave your tea on the counter and find it hours later, cold and abandoned?" She smiled weakly. "Something like that." By evening, the unease had grown into a gnawing restlessness. She decided to take a walk after closing, hoping the crisp night air would clear her mind. The city was alive with the hum of life. Street musicians playing lilting tunes, laughter spilling out of pubs, the distant clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage on the cobblestones. Yet Eleanor felt apart from it all, as though she were moving through a story whose plot she couldn't grasp. Her feet carried her back to Kelton Hill, where the memories she couldn't quite reach seemed to beckon. She stood at the overlook, the city sprawling beneath her like a sea of lights. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. "You came back." The voice startled her. Eleanor turned sharply, and there he was, Adrian. He looked exactly as she'd imagined he might, though she couldn't explain why. His gray eyes studied her with a mix of relief and apprehension, as if he hadn't been sure she'd appear. "Do I know you?" she asked hesitantly. Adrian's expression tightened. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver device, no bigger than a pocket watch. Its surface gleamed in the moonlight, etched with markings that looked almost alien. "I didn't think I'd have to explain again," he said, mostly to himself. Eleanor took a step back, her heart pounding. "What is that? Who are you?" "I'm someone who wasn't supposed to stay," Adrian said, his voice heavy with regret. "But then I met you." She stared at him, her mind racing. None of it made sense. The note, the feeling of forgetting, the strange device in his hand. "What are you talking about?" Adrian hesitated, then sighed. "You're not going to believe me, but I'll tell you anyway, because you deserve the truth." He held up the device. "I'm not from here. Not from this time, at least. My work, it involves moving through timelines, observing how choices ripple across realities. Last night I wasn't supposed to interact with anyone, but then I met you, and I couldn't help myself." Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. "You're saying you're... what, a time traveler?" "Not just time," Adrian corrected. "I traverse possibilities, the lives we might live, the ones we'll never know. But there's a rule: we're not supposed to leave traces. No connections, no disruptions." He gestured to the note she still clutched in her hand. "I broke that rule for you." Eleanor's knees felt weak. She leaned against the stone railing, trying to steady herself. "Why would you do that?" Adrian stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Because in every possibility, in every timeline I've ever seen, I've never met anyone like you. And I couldn't bear the thought of leaving without letting you know." The weight of his words settled over her, leaving her breathless. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to tell him he was mad, but deep down, she felt something click, as though a puzzle piece had fallen into place. "And now what?" she whispered. Adrian's expression darkened. "Now I have to leave. The longer I stay, the more unstable this timeline becomes. I'm not supposed to exist here, Eleanor. It's dangerous, for both of us." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't just tell me all this and then disappear." "I don't have a choice." Adrian raised the device, his hand trembling. "But I had to see you one last time. I had to tell you." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. "Don't go." Adrian hesitated, his own eyes glistening. "I wish I could stay. In another life, maybe, but not this one." He pressed a button on the device, and a blinding light enveloped him. When it faded, he was gone. Eleanor stood alone on the hill, the night eerily silent around her. The only proof he had ever been there was the note in her hand and the ache in her chest. A love story written across timelines, never meant to be. Chapter 3. The Echoes of What Was. In the days that followed, Eleanor felt as though she were walking through a dream. The city, once so vibrant and alive, seemed muted, its edges blurred like an old photograph. She carried the note everywhere, tucked safely in her journal, reading and rereading the words as if they might unlock some deeper truth. She couldn't tell anyone. Not Isaac, not her friends, because who would believe her? The rational part of her mind insisted it had been a trick, an elaborate hoax, or the product of her own overactive imagination. Yet, late at night, when the world was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts, she knew the truth. Adrian had been real. And so was the loss. Weeks turned into months, and winter descended upon Edinburgh. The bookshop became her refuge, its familiar chaos a balm for the unshakable ache in her chest. One snowy evening, as she organized a display of antique atlases, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic hidden between the pages of a book. It was a key, a small, intricate key, its handle shaped like a starburst. Beneath it was a folded piece of parchment. Follow the thread. Her pulse quickened. She flipped the book over, searching for more clues, but found nothing. The note was unsigned, but something about the handwriting felt familiar. It wasn't Adrian's, but it had the same deliberate elegance. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She stared at the key, its metallic surface catching the light of her bedside lamp. Follow the thread. What thread? She thought of Adrian's words, his talk of possibilities and timelines, and a strange sense of anticipation began to bloom in her chest. The next morning, she returned to the bookshop before sunrise, using her spare key to let herself in. The silence of the shop felt different in the early hours, as though the books themselves were holding their breath. She retraced her steps to the atlas section, scanning the shelves for anything that might stand out. And then she saw it. One of the atlases, an unassuming leather-bound volume, had a faint shimmer to its spine, as though dusted with starlight. Eleanor pulled it from the shelf, her hands trembling. She opened it to the center, where the pages were blank, save for a thin silver thread embedded in the paper. Without hesitation, she placed the key into the lock that was etched into the book's spine. A faint click echoed in the stillness, and the thread began to glow, unraveling from the page and floating upward, suspended in the air like a trail of light. Eleanor didn't stop to question what was happening. She followed the thread as it wove through the shop, past shelves and ladders, curling around corners until it led her to the back room. The air seemed charged with energy, the faint hum of something unseen filling her ears. The thread stopped in front of an old, dusty mirror that Eleanor had never paid much attention to before. Its surface was cracked at the edges, and the frame was carved with symbols she couldn't decipher. The glowing thread coiled at its base, pulsing gently as if waiting for her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the glass. Instead of cold, unyielding solidity, her hand passed through as though the surface were water. Her breath hitched, and she hesitated, fear and curiosity warring within her. But then she thought of Adrian, of his eyes, his voice, the way he had looked at her on that hill, and stepped through. Eleanor emerged into a world both familiar and alien. The air was crisp, the sky a deep indigo speckled with stars that seemed impossibly close. She stood in a forest, the trees glowing faintly with bioluminescent light. A narrow path wound ahead of her, illuminated by floating orbs that bobbed gently as though beckoning her forward. She walked cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the soft chirping of unseen creatures felt amplified, as though the world itself were alive and aware of her presence. The path led to a clearing, where a lone figure stood beneath a towering tree that shimmered with golden leaves. It was Adrian. He turned at the sound of her approach, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief, and then to something else, something softer, tinged with hope. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't think I'd let you leave without answers, did you?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Adrian closed the distance between them, his eyes searching hers. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it's not meant for you. Then why did you leave me the key? I didn't, Adrian said, his brow furrowing. At least, not in this timeline. Eleanor's breath caught. Then who did? Before Adrian could answer, the ground beneath them trembled, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. The tree's golden leaves began to shimmer more brightly, casting a blinding light over the clearing. Eleanor, listen to me, Adrian said urgently, grabbing her hands. This place, this moment, is a nexus. It's unstable. If you stay, you could be trapped between timelines forever. But if I leave, I'll lose you again, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Adrian's grip tightened. There's another way. I can stabilize this, but it means... He hesitated, his voice breaking. It means I won't exist in any timeline. Not like this, but you'll be safe. No, Eleanor said fiercely. There has to be another way. Adrian smiled sadly. In every possibility, Eleanor, you were worth the risk. The light from the tree engulfed them, and Eleanor felt the world begin to fracture around her. Adrian's voice was the last thing she heard before everything went white. Find me again, in another possibility. Eleanor awoke on the floor of the bookshop, the atlas clutched in her hands. The silver thread was gone, the pages blank. The mirror in the back room was shattered, its fragments glinting like stars scattered across the floor. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Because somehow she knew their story wasn't over. Not yet. Threads of Fate. The weeks that followed felt like a strange limbo for Eleanor. The broken mirror in the back room had been swept away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that its shards were still scattered across her life, reflecting fragments of a story she wasn't meant to leave behind. She kept the atlas with her at all times, even though its pages were stubbornly blank. The silver key, now hanging from a chain around her neck, felt heavier with each passing day. Adrian's final words echoed in her mind. Find me again, in another possibility. But how? It was a dreary February afternoon when the next clue found her. Eleanor was rearranging a shelf of secondhand novels when a customer, a young woman with piercing green eyes and a scarf patterned like a star map, placed a book on the counter. I think this is yours, the woman said with a cryptic smile. Eleanor frowned. I'm sorry, we don't accept donations directly. The woman shook her head. It's not a donation. It's a message. Before Eleanor could respond, the woman was gone, her scarf trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Eleanor stared after her for a moment before glancing down at the book. It was thin, bound in midnight blue leather, with no title or author on the cover. When she opened it, her breath caught. There, on the first page, was a drawing of the glowing tree she had seen in the clearing. Beneath it was a single line of text, written in the same hand as the mysterious note she'd found with the key. The first step is to remember. That night, Eleanor sat in her apartment, the book open before her on the table. She traced the lines of the drawing with her fingers, willing it to give her answers. What did it mean to remember? She had seen the tree, felt its power, but the memory felt fragile, as if it might slip away at any moment. She turned the page, and another image appeared. A star map, its constellations unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. Her fingers brushed over the map, and a faint warmth pulsed beneath her touch. The lines connecting the stars began to shimmer, forming new patterns until they converged into the shape of the silver key hanging around her neck. And then she remembered. The tree, the light. Adrian's hands gripping hers as the world fractured around them. But there was more, buried deep in the folds of her memory, a moment she hadn't realized she'd forgotten. As the light had consumed them, Adrian had pressed something into her hand. She hadn't noticed it then, but now she remembered the weight, the shape. Her heart racing, Eleanor rushed to her coat and searched the pockets. At first, there was nothing. But then her fingers brushed against something small and cold. She pulled it out, a tiny silver disc etched with swirling patterns, almost like circuitry. She held it up to the light, her mind racing. Was this another piece of the puzzle Adrian had left behind? The next day, Eleanor took the disc to an old watchmaker she knew, a man named Mr. Kearney who specialized in repairing strange antique mechanisms. The workshop smelled of oil and dust, and the walls were lined with shelves of clocks ticking in eerie synchronization. Mr. Kearney squinted at the disc through his magnifying glasses. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "It's complicated," Eleanor replied. Humph, he muttered, turning the disc over in his hands. This isn't just a trinket. It's a key, or part of one anyway. See these grooves? They're designed to fit into something. Fit into what? He shrugged. Could be anything. A lock, a machine, something ancient, or something far beyond what we understand. But whatever it is, it's not from around here. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Can you figure out how to use it? Mr. Kearney studied the disc for a long moment before nodding. Leave it with me. Come back in a week. That week felt like an eternity. Eleanor pored over the blue book and the atlas, searching for connections, for patterns, for anything that might explain what was happening. She felt as though she were on the edge of something monumental, but the path ahead remained shrouded in fog. When the day finally came to return to Mr. Howe, Kearney's workshop, she could barely keep her hands steady. I've got good news and bad news, the watchmaker said as she entered. Start with the good news. He held up the disc, now attached to a small, intricate device that resembled a compass. I figured out how to activate it. Whatever this thing is, it's designed to point you somewhere. Eleanor's breath caught. And the bad news? Mr. Kearney sighed. Once you activate it, there's no turning back. Whatever it's pointing to, you won't be able to stop until you get there. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the device in front of her. She knew she was standing at the edge of a choice, one that could change everything. Her fingers hovered over the activation switch. She thought of Adrian, of his final words, of the promise etched into her heart. With a deep breath, she flipped the switch. The compass began to glow, its needle spinning wildly before locking onto a direction. A soft hum filled the air, and the device pulsed once, as if urging her forward. Eleanor grabbed her coat, the atlas, and the blue book. And then she stepped into the unknown. Chapter 5. The compass led Eleanor far beyond the city, its glowing needle unerringly pointing north. Snow swirled around her as she drove through the winding highland roads, the headlights of her car cutting through the darkness. Every so often the compass would pulse, a subtle vibration in her hand as if reassuring her that she was on the right path. Hours passed, the world outside growing wilder and more untamed. Finally, the device's light intensified, casting her car interior in a silvery glow. The needle began to spin again, and Eleanor knew she had arrived. She stopped at the base of a rocky hill, where the ruins of an ancient stone circle loomed against the star-filled sky. The snow seemed to avoid the stones, leaving the ground within the circle untouched, as though preserved by some unseen force. Clutching the compass and the silver key around her neck, Eleanor stepped into the circle. The air crackled with energy, and a low hum vibrated through the ground. The compass pulsed one last time, then went dark, its work complete. Eleanor's breath misted in the cold air as she looked around, her heart pounding. "What now?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the stillness. As if in answer, the key around her neck began to glow faintly. She reached for it, feeling its warmth against her skin, and held it up. The symbols etched into the stones began to light up, one by one, forming a swirling pattern of lines and curves that reminded her of the circuitry on the silver disc. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and a soft blue light rose from the center of the circle, forming a shimmering doorway. Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing with questions. Was Adrian on the other side? What if this was a trap or a mistake? But the memory of his voice, his promise, pushed her forward. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the light. The world shifted around her, and Eleanor found herself standing on a vast, floating platform of silver and glass. Above her stretched a sky unlike any she had ever seen. Rivers of light in shades of gold, violet, and green danced across the heavens, their reflections shimmering in the platform beneath her feet. A structure stood at the center of the platform, a towering spire that seemed to hum with life. Its surface was smooth and seamless, yet it pulsed faintly, with a rhythm that reminded Eleanor of a heartbeat. She approached cautiously, the key in her hand glowing brighter with every step. As she neared the spire, a door appeared, sliding open soundlessly to reveal a chamber bathed in soft, golden light. Adrian was there. He stood at the center of the room, his back to her, studying a holographic map that floated in the air. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes widening in shock. "Eleanor?" For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Eleanor ran to him, throwing her arms around him. Adrian hesitated, as though unsure if she was real, before wrapping his arms tightly around her. "You found me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me to," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't just let it end like that." Adrian pulled back slightly, his hands on her shoulders. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it's unstable. It's why I didn't want you to follow me." "Then why leave the clues? The key? The compass?" "I didn't," Adrian said, his brow furrowing. "At least, not directly. This spire, this nexus, it acts on its own. It must have responded to something, or someone." Eleanor stepped back, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" Before Adrian could answer, the spire trembled, and the holographic map shifted, its edges flickering. A voice echoed through the chamber, smooth and melodic, yet tinged with urgency. "Intrusion detected. Stabilization protocols failing. Nexus collapse imminent." Adrian's face paled. No, this isn't supposed to happen." "What's going on?" Eleanor asked, panic rising in her chest. "The Nexus, it's a connection point between timelines," Adrian explained hurriedly. "It wasn't meant to hold us both. Our presence here is destabilizing it." "Then what do we do?" Adrian hesitated, his gaze shifting to the glowing map. "I can recalibrate it. It would mean cutting this timeline off from all others. It would stabilize the Nexus, but you'd be trapped here," Eleanor realized, her voice breaking. Adrian nodded. "And you'd have to leave." "No." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "There has to be another way." Adrian stepped closer, his expression pained but resolute. "Eleanor, this place, it's a miracle you found it, but it wasn't meant to exist forever. If we don't act now, it'll collapse, and we'll both be lost." Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I just got you back. I can't lose you again." Adrian cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and steady. "You won't. In every possibility, in every timeline, I'll find you. But right now, you have to trust me." The spire trembled again, the golden light flickering. The voice returned, more urgent this time. "Nexus collapse in 60 seconds." Adrian pulled the silver key from around her neck and pressed it into her hands. "This will guide you back home. You need to go, Eleanor." "No." Adrian kissed her, cutting off her protest. It was a kiss filled with all the words they didn't have time to say, a promise of what could have been and what might still be. When he pulled away, his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Go." Eleanor's body felt like it was moving on its own as the golden doorway reappeared behind her. She turned back one last time, her heart breaking at the sight of Adrian standing alone in the flickering chamber. "I'll find you," she whispered, stepping through the light. Eleanor awoke on the cold ground outside the stone circle, the silver key clutched in her hand. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky above was clear and bright, filled with stars. The stone circle was silent, the doorway gone. But as Eleanor looked up at the night sky, she felt a spark of hope. Somewhere, in another possibility, Adrian was waiting. And no matter how many timelines she had to cross, she would find him again. Final chapter, Across the Stars. The days that followed felt heavier for Eleanor. She walked through her life as though carrying an invisible weight, each moment tinged with the ache of Adrian's absence. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world seemed still and vast, she held on to his promise. "In every possibility, I'll find you." The silver key remained with her always, a tangible reminder of the impossible journey she had taken. It no longer glowed, but when she touched it, she could almost feel the faint hum of something waiting, something alive. Eleanor had returned to her quiet life in Edinburgh, but she wasn't the same. The bookshop, the familiar streets, even the people she knew, all of it felt distant, like a story she no longer belonged to. Yet she kept moving forward, driven by the belief that her story with Adrian wasn't over. And then, one evening, the key came alive again. She was sitting by the fire, rereading the blue book with the drawing of the tree, when the key began to pulse faintly against her chest. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then the pulses grew stronger, steady like a heartbeat. Eleanor clutched it tightly, her heart racing. The atlas on the table began to shimmer, its blank pages filling with faint, glowing lines. They formed a map, one she didn't recognize, but which called to her all the same. At the edge of the map, in tiny, elegant script, were 2 words: "He waits." The map led her to a forgotten train station on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with mist, and the tracks were overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, yet as Eleanor stepped onto the platform, she heard the distant rumble of an approaching train. A sleek, silver locomotive emerged from the fog, its surface gleaming like liquid moonlight. It came to a stop before her, and the door slid open soundlessly. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The interior of the train was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls shimmered with shifting colors, and the floor felt warm beneath her feet, as though alive. There were no passengers, only a single chair at the center of the carriage. On the seat rested a small device, another compass, but this one had a crystal-like orb at its center, glowing faintly. When Eleanor picked it up, the train began to move. The journey felt timeless. Eleanor watched as the train sped through landscapes that defied explanation. Endless fields of golden grass, skies filled with floating islands, oceans that sparkled with what looked like stars. Each time she glanced at the compass, the orb's light grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the key around her neck. It felt as though the train were carrying her not just through space, but through something deeper. Realities, possibilities, perhaps even time itself. Finally, the train slowed, coming to a halt in a place that looked like the edge of existence itself. Eleanor stepped onto a platform suspended in a sea of light. Above her, the sky was a kaleidoscope of shifting colors, and the air hummed with energy. At the center of the platform stood a figure, his back to her, gazing out at the endless expanse. "Adrian," she whispered. He turned, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, they simply stared at each other as though afraid the other might disappear. Then Adrian smiled, a smile filled with relief, wonder, and something deeper. "You found me," he said, his voice barely audible. "You told me to," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. Adrian reached out, and she took his hand. The connection between them felt electric, as though the universe itself acknowledged their reunion. "How is this possible?" she asked. Adrian's gaze softened. "The nexus didn't collapse completely. It fractured, but it left traces, threads of possibilities that connected us. I've been following them, waiting for the one where you'd find your way back to me." Eleanor's breath hitched. "And now?" Adrian glanced at the shifting expanse around them. "This place, it's not bound by the rules of any single reality. It's a bridge, a place where we can choose what comes next." She frowned. "Choose?" He nodded. "We can return to your timeline, your world, and live as we did before. Or—" He hesitated, searching her face. "We can step into something new, a life not bound by any timeline, a possibility that's just ours." Eleanor's heart ached with the weight of the choice. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the bookshop, her friends, the quiet comfort of the familiar. But when she looked into Adrian's eyes, she knew the answer. "I choose you," she said softly. Adrian's smile widened, and he pulled her close, their foreheads touching. As they stood together on the edge of existence, the light around them began to shift, folding inward like a star being born. The platform dissolved beneath their feet, and the universe seemed to hold them gently, cradling them in its infinite possibilities. Somewhere in a small bookshop in Edinburgh, a customer found an atlas tucked into the corner of a shelf. Its pages were filled with strange maps and glowing threads, but when they brought it to the counter, the clerk couldn't remember how it got there. And in a world beyond time and space, where golden trees shimmered and skies danced with light, Eleanor and Adrian walked hand in hand, their story finally, truly, beginning.